Fairy tales are timeless short stories that can be enjoyed by many people of all ages. They are often used to teach a lesson and contain fantasy elements, which is why many kids like them. Those who have a childlike spirit, such as myself, can also find these stories to be entertaining, and it's no wonder why some of Disney's most successful movies are based on them. Rapunzel, Sleeping Beauty, and the Snow Queen are all traditional fairy tales that have been loved throughout many generations. While the majority of popular fairy tales were written and published throughout the 1800s, there are newer and longer stories that some people consider to be a fairy tale, such as The Hobbit. On one hand, the writing style of this fantasy story is very similar to what people would expect from a fairy tale. On the other hand, it is much longer and is more commonly thought of as one of the earliest and most popular novels in the epic fantasy genre. I can understand both sides of the argument, and when I think of The Hobbit, I just think of one of the best books I've ever read. However, we must ask ourselves, if The Hobbit can be considered a fairy tale, what other stories can be as well? The Unfinished Swan is a video game developed by Giant Sparrow that released in 2012. Similar to The Hobbit, it has a lot in common with fairy tales, so much so that I wouldn't argue with anyone who considered it to be one. As I will be discussing the story of this game, as well as What Remains of Edith Finch, another game that Giant Sparrow made, I suggest turning this video off if you wish to avoid spoilers and haven't played either one of them. In last week's video, I analyzed What Remains of Edith Finch, and suggest you watch that video, which I'll leave a link to in the description. It's completely fine if you only want to watch this video, but there are a few connections between the two games, so watching my analysis on What Remains of Edith Finch will give you more context to the overall story Giant Sparrow told. Anyways, when starting the Unfinished Swan, players can see that the title screen shows a book. This is obviously a children's story due to its horizontal shape and the illustrations inside. As you can guess, the Unfinished Swan has a very short and simple, yet imaginative story, just like most fairy tales. It is about a boy named Monroe whose mother recently passed away. Before players even begin taking control of Monroe, we have another reason to compare this game to stories like Snow White and Beauty and the Beast, as mothers are often absent in those fairy tales. If there is any mother figure in a fairy tale, it is rare that it is not either an incredibly minor character or an evil stepmother. The Unfinished Swan, however, still feels very original despite killing Monroe's mother off due to how important she is to the story. She loved painting, but never finished any of her projects, and after she dies, the orphanage that Monroe goes to allows him to bring one of them. He chooses the Unfinished Swan, hence the title of the game. However, when the swan escapes the canvas it was created on and walks through a mysterious door, Monroe finds himself following his mother's creation and entering a mysterious world. At first, everything appears to be as white as a blank canvas, but by having Monroe throw black ink around, players can discover an entire kingdom of art made by a character known as the King. As they explore his kingdom, they will find letters that reveal paintings and text that inform them about the king's past. A narrator reads the text, which, you guessed it, has a writing style similar to a fairy tale.
The vines were slowly burying the king and his city. No matter what he tried, the king couldn't stop them. So he decided to create something that could. He mixed in paint thinner, malice and snot, and soon had the outlines of a pretty horrible creature. But it wasn't until the thing began to coil its tentacles and snap its jaws that the king understood what he had made. And for the first time in his life, the king was afraid.
There are also longer scenes in between the game's chapters in which the narrator reads Monroe's story.
Monroe scrambled out of the water and found himself in a massive city with no sign of the swan or anyone else. Well, except someone's enormous pair of feet. These were attached to a giant who could have been a big help in catching the swan, but unfortunately, here was the laziest giant who had ever lived. And it was his day off. Having celebrated in his usual way, he was now sleeping it off and quite unable to hear Monroe yelling. While he was looking for a way to wake the giant, Monroe noticed something even better: a floating ship.
The minor characters mentioned in these scenes also feel like they came straight out of a fairy tale, as a giant and the horrible creature that the king created can appeal to children. Towards the end of the game, Monroe and the players learned that the king had painted a wife, who was very similar to him. The two painted a lot but didn't finish any of their projects. However, the king remained so lost in his own world, both literally and figuratively, that he didn't realize for months that his wife was pregnant, foreshadowing that he is Monroe's father. This is confirmed when players arrive at an incomplete monument that the king had made of himself. Monroe meets the king, who tells the young boy about a dream he had in which his kingdom was destroyed. He also gives him his paintbrush, stating,
"This brush isn't mine anymore. My work is over. It belongs to you now. I hope it makes you happy and that someday they will say, he is a better man than his father."
The Swan grabs the paintbrush, and Monroe follows the bird out a door, which leads him back to his room at the orphanage. There, he decides to paint a finished swan with 2 signets, bringing an end to the game's story. While Monroe's journey was a short one, he learned a lot about where he came from and made the important decision to return to the real world, unlike his father. Their journeys parallel one another in many ways. In the beginning of the story, the king felt that his garden should be white as no other colors were good enough for it, and Monroe painted parts of it over in black. Due to his son's contributions, the king's work became more visible, and the combination of the black and white ink added more beauty than either value had alone. Later on, when players used vines to travel around the kingdom, they learned that the king wanted to get rid of them. While he was bothered and held back by the vines, Monroe found a creative way to use them to his advantage, allowing him to progress further into the kingdom. From these 2 examples, we can see that Monroe and his father had very different ways of thinking, despite both of them being so artistic. Due to the king's final words to his son, I believe that he regretted a lot of the decisions he made in his kingdom, and that was one of the reasons why he easily accepted the destruction of his work. He found Monroe's way of thinking to be healthier and more effective, and hoped that as long as his son stayed true to himself, his art would be far more beautiful. Monroe, knowing what his father had made and where he ended up in life, could be inspired to live in a way that was equally creative but less limiting, and so he returned to the orphanage to live his life as an artist who looked at the world from both a realistic and ingenious perspective, a decision that the king would have been proud of. So how does Giant Sparrow's other game, What Remains of Edith Finch, fit into all of this? Well, the main character had a brother, Milton, who I, along with many other fans, believe is the king. Milton was a painter who had gone missing. When Edith returns to their childhood home, she goes to his room and sees a flip book called The Magic Paintbrush, in which Milton walks through a door that is very similar to the one Monroe and the Swan went through. Looking around Milton's room, players can see references to the unfinished swan. Pictures that Milton made can be found on one of the walls in his room, which players can also find in the concept art section of Giant Sparrow's first game. In fact, there are many similarities between the concept art and the Finch house. If you look at the screen, you'll see some side-by-side comparisons. Take this image of a spiral staircase, for example. It looks just like the one leading to Edith's room. The outside of Milton's room shares a lot of similarities to the small tower in the unfinished Swan. There is also a small bridge that looks nearly identical to one that players may pass on their way to the Finch house. I think that Milton got a lot of inspiration from the house his ancestors built when making his kingdom, as well as the giant monument of himself. To further support this idea, the king mentions his childhood home when telling Monroe about the dream he had. In this section of the game, players get to control the king and see what the home was like. While there aren't any parts of the house that look identical to the king's painting, we must remember that he wouldn't be making an exact copy of it, but taking inspiration from his memory of it. With that in mind, I think this painting resembles the Finch's living room. It should also be noted that Dawn, Milton's mother, looks a bit similar to the king's wife, which could be a subtle way of saying that he misses his family. If the king and Milton are in fact the same person, I think that the lessons that can be taught through the unfinished Swan are even more impactful. This game, in my opinion, tells players that they should balance their imagination with reality. There are many things to enjoy in the real world, and it's good to go out there and find them, whether they be a piece of artwork or a bond shared with another person. The king left his family, the settlers of his kingdom, and ignored the wife he created. His strongest bond was with his pet hippo, and they seemed to mostly just exist around one another mother, rather than having a very strong connection. He can't even form that close of a bond with his son, who now knows that even without his mother, he doesn't have to feel like he's all alone. He can form actual friendships with the other children at the orphanage or fellow artists and live a happier life than the king did by both expressing himself and accepting other people's ideas. There doesn't have to be a limit to creativity, but there also doesn't have to be a limit to reality. They can coexist just as much as a white canvas and black ink, and those who look at the world from this perspective may find even more happiness than a king when their time in it is finished.